You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 4th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, as the US charges Hamas leaders for their role in the murder of Americans in Israel on October the 7th, we'll ask about those protesting for the release of hostages and which high-profile Palestinian political prisoner could be in a position to become the unifying face of the Palestinian Authority. Despite relative political stability, France seems no further forward to finding a unifying face of its own to take on the job of Prime Minister. The process is beginning to feel as if it's been scripted by Georges Feydeau. Then,
we still see and feel that there is a lot of support in governments, among the people and so on, but it's becoming more and more difficult because the context has been changing.
We'll hear from Iryna Krasnoshtan, the programme director of the International Centre for Ukrainian Victory, who spoke to our team at Globsec last week. And Kieran Pender, our Olympic correspondent, joins us to reflect on the Summer Games. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. The United States Justice Department has announced that it's charged several leaders of Hamas, the Palestinian militant group, for the deadly attack in Israel on the 7th of October last year, during which over 40 Americans were murdered. Meanwhile, protests are continuing in Israel, calling for the government to secure a hostage deal with Hamas. Well, Julie Norman is a lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL, and she's on the line now. Julie, many thanks for coming back on this programme. Is this legal development largely symbolic? I mean, of the accused Hamas leaders left alive, is there much prospect of ever bringing them to justice?
Well, good afternoon, Georgina. Yes, I would say in real terms, this is more of a symbolic move. Of the individuals who have been charged, at least 3 have already been killed over the course of the hostilities over the last 11 months. And it's really unlikely that the United States, I think, could arrest someone like Yahya Sinwar, who's presumed to be hiding in the tunnels under Gaza, and say, bring him to the U.S. I would also note this is charges that were filed back in February, and the U.S. just unsealed them now. So it was a move in that regard, too, I think, to show that U.S. is still taking it seriously, is still going after Hamas leaders, is just doing so in a bit more public way now.
Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has begged for forgiveness from the Israeli people for not being able to bring home alive the 6 hostages whose bodies were found in Gaza on Saturday. This has done little to quell the protests. Can you tell us more about the demonstrators within Israel and what it is that they want?
Sure. I mean, I think Netanyahu's apology or ask for forgiveness rings quite hollow. I mean, this is the execution of the 6 hostages last week, their bodies being brought back, really was just adding to months and months of distraught from the Israeli public, especially from hostages' families and their supporters, feeling that Netanyahu is not only not doing enough, but in many eyes, actually trying to obstruct the ceasefire negotiations for political gain. And so when you had hostages who were alive as of last week, were on the list to be released in an exchange, people feel that Netanyahu has just kept introducing new elements to the ceasefire negotiations that prevented those people from coming home safely.
What do Palestinians want in terms of their prisoners being held in Israeli jails? Many say that Marwan Barghouti, who's dubbed Palestine's Nelson Mandela, could be key to solving the crisis. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, so there are thousands of Palestinians who are detained or incarcerated in Israeli prisons. And a big part of the ceasefire negotiations is releasing a relatively large number of those prisoners in exchange for the Israeli hostages. A big part of the negotiations, as you alluded to, is which prisoners will be released. And there are several high-profile individuals. The highest profile is Barghouti. He has been held in prison since 2002, and he's really seen as the political figure who could potentially unify Palestinians across West Bank, Gaza, across Fatah, Hamas, and is really seen as the most popular leader in Palestine. So his release is one that Palestinians are hoping for. Many internationals are hoping for, seeing him as a future Palestinian leader. But I would say it's precisely because of those reasons that some in the Israeli government are reluctant to include him in this deal.
But so how significant would his release be, and what would a Palestine under him look like?
Well, I think we don't really know. He obviously has been in prison for the last 2 decades. So on the one hand, he's not tainted with a lot of the corruption, a lot of the dissatisfaction people have with both Fatah and Hamas at this point. But it's unclear how exactly he would rule. He came up through the Fatah organization. He supported the peace process initially in the 90s, but became very disillusioned with it and moved back to supporting resistance in the Second Intifada. So in that regard, he speaks to a lot of different groups. But again, it's unclear what kind of government he could actually bring in, what Palestinian elections would look like at this point. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns as to how Barghouti could or would actually govern. But the most important thing I can say about him is that he, even from prison, has made many attempts to unify Fatah and Hamas and to unify Palestinians. And that right now, when I speak with Palestinians, they see as the most important thing for moving Palestinian nationalism forward.
Now, as you say, the idea is that this list of prisoners topped by Barghouti would be exchanged for the 108 Israeli hostages in Gaza. And as we were discussing, those protests by the families and the supporters of the hostages are ongoing within Israel. Could they topple Netanyahu's government?
Well, I would say that's what many are certainly hoping for, but Netanyahu has shown great resilience in hanging on, and I think will try and continue to do so for as long as possible. And, right now, Israeli politics are quite divided. People may remember in the years prior to last year on October 7th, there were a series of Israeli elections trying to get a coalition government or some kind of government in place. And so right now, I would say he has still managed to hold that together, but it's going to be difficult for him to do that indefinitely. And many Israelis will also be looking for elections very soon.
Julie, thank you very much indeed. That was Julie Norman. Now, here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has resigned, the highest profile casualty so far of a major government reshuffle ordered by President Volodymyr Zelensky. His resignation comes at a crucial juncture in a 30-month war against Russia. After Zelensky, Kuleba was the best-known face of Ukraine overseas, meeting leaders around the world and lobbying for military and political support. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is holding talks with President Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey today, in the first presidential-level visit in 12 years, as the two regional powers begin to resume harmonious relations. The visit comes after Erdogan travelled to Cairo in February, his first trip to Egypt since 2012, taking a major step towards rebuilding ties that were severely strained for a decade. And the Dutch army will have its own tank unit for the first time in more than 10 years. The setup of this unit, which will help the Netherlands comply with the NATO target of spending at least 2% of its GDP on defence, will cost between 260 million and 315 million euros per year. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Carlotta. France is in the midst of unprecedented political uncertainty. A caretaker government has run the country since July, following snap elections in June that failed to deliver an absolute majority in the French National Assembly. The New Popular Front, an alliance of parties on the left, won the most seats, but President Emmanuel Macron has refused to appoint their candidate. Philippe Mallière, who's Professor of French and European Politics at University College London, joins me on the line now. Philippe, welcome back to the briefing. Has this just become a little bit farcical? I mean, tell us about some of the jokes and memes that have been sparked by this crisis of leadership.
Hello, Georgina. Yes, it is becoming a bit farcical for the reason you just gave us, which is, it's been now 49 days since the election, which for sure gave a victor, the left bloc, but also for sure it's an election which Macron lost. So I think now people are getting a bit impatient. But, when you get impatient, if not exasperated. You have, if you spend some time on the social media, notably on X, you will find now people are taking the mickey of the president, and rightly so, for having painted himself into a corner and now waiting. Some are sort of seeing that as delaying tactics. So they are jokes, people. I've read tweets saying, well, he will have soon consulted the whole nation except for the actual results of the election, meaning, of course, that that's what he should do, and probably he should appoint, to start with, Julie Castet for the left, or make another joke saying, well, he will consult one MP per day, so that will take him 577 days, because that's the overall number of MPs. But I think the joke, which in fact isn't a joke, which I found really most amusing, was that on Monday there was an announcement made by the presidency saying that he wouldn't appoint anyone on Monday, because on Monday there was the start of the school year. So a bit funny, a bit strange also that sort of the start of the new school year would allegedly clash with his own appointment.
Extraordinary. I mean, what former leaders has he been reaching out to for advice?
Well, I think it's virtually, and that's part of the sort of running gag now, he's virtually now consulted with everyone. He even consulted with the far-right representatives. Marine Le Pen was invited last week to the Élysée Palace, but now he is, of course, he said that he would not, of course, and rightly so, appoint the far-right to office. He would not also appoint Julie Castet. But apart from that, all the leaders were sort of paid a visit to the president in the Élysée Palace, and some are now having a second round of consultation. They are carried out by phone now because, of course, time is of the essence now. So lots of people, and particularly the left, said, well, if you do not appoint anyone, if you do not appoint our candidate, Julie Castet, we will not go back. And now there was a sort of change of tact on the part of left-wing leaders. They are in touch again. That shows one thing above all, Georgina, is that the situation is getting desperate, and Macron, having sort of led those consultations in a fairly partial manner. That's what his critics are saying now in France, excluding the left, notably, which won the election. Now, of course, is in a very complex situation, because having excluded the left, who can he appoint, bearing in mind that no bloc in the National Assembly has an absolute majority? So you need coalition. You need at least that one bloc doesn't censor an appointing prime minister and government. So it's all very complex. But Macron, by being a fairly partial player so far, has made the situation more difficult for himself.
So who's in the frame? Who are the top contenders?
I think there are names being floated would be, in particular, a former prime minister, socialist, a moderate, centre-left. Bernard Cazeneuve is his name. He was prime minister during the Hollande presidency at the very end of it in 2017. That's the kind of name that is being floated, because you need someone who's moderate enough to be able to work together with other political forces. Xavier Bertrand, more surprising proposal, because Xavier Bertrand is the leader of Les Républicains, the main conservative party, but which had a bad election, losing lots of seats. So it's a very small parliamentary group, Les Républicains. So these are the two names which are being floated. But there are other names like technicians, people no one had ever heard of, and very, very difficult to predict, to say today who will eventually get appointed, and let alone when that person will get appointed.
And Philippe, how long can France go on like this before a new election needs to be called?
Well, the incumbent government, the one which lost the election, that's part of the ongoing farce or gag, is there to govern. The thing is, when you lost an election, you can't really start passing legislation which might be regarded as controversial by your opponents. So they're just there for the sort of day-to-day business. It could take a long time. I suppose that the situation is getting really tense now because Macron decided on the political truce during the Olympics, how handy it was to have the Olympics to decide that. But now he's got no further excuses. You've got the Paralympics going, but that's probably not a major excuse now. So he's got really to find a prime minister. I think he wants to do that now. The trouble is, as I said earlier, the situation is more complex for him because he's excluded the left. He's now regarded by all the other parties as a sort of partial, being politically involved in the game. He shouldn't be doing that as president. So very hard to tell. I suppose it's a matter of days.
Philippe, thank you very much indeed. That's Philippe Mallier there. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. More than 2.5 years into its war against Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has aimed to keep up the pressure on the international community to maintain its commitment to the country. Iryna Krasnoshtan is amongst those at the centre of that advocacy as Programme Director of the International Centre for Ukrainian Victory. Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke with Iryna at the recent GlobeSec Forum in Prague and began by asking her what the programme's work consists of now.
We continue, as for the 2.5 past years, to advocate for Ukrainian victory amongst our international partners. The International Center for Ukrainian Victory, only from the sound of its name, people know what we are here for and what we want from them. So, we continue to mobilize the partners. And to be honest, sometimes we feel like we are in a situation more or less as we were in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in the sense of the fact that we still have to go back to our partners about some basic stuff. For example, with the attacks on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, this was a big deal in the first winter, and we are now back again to this big catastrophe that may be happening to us in a few months, and we have to raise this once again. So a lot of things are still high on our agenda. There are several other aspects that we are working on. For example, on the confiscation of Russian frozen assets. It has moved quite a lot for the last year, let's say, but still, after this big decision that was made in Italy this summer, we still need to push for its implementation, because the political decision is there, but we don't know about the loan from the proceeds from the Russian frozen assets, but the practicalities of it still needs to be figured out. And, we need this support, this money as soon as possible. So that's probably the most important things are energy security, which means first more air defense for Ukraine, but also we are discussing now with the partners the possibility of the countries that are neighboring with Ukraine to help us actually shut down some of the targets that are flying. And this is a very difficult and sensitive question, of course, for some of them, but I think it's really important for Ukraine.
I know that nobody is more tired of this after 2.5 years than Ukrainians are, but nevertheless, do you detect after 2.5 years that there is an ebbing of patience, of enthusiasm among Ukraine's partners? Is it hard for you to keep people focused and keep people energized?
It's yes and no, because on one hand, Ukraine, despite what a lot of people are saying about the fatigue and so on, Ukraine is still very much up on everyone's agenda. And we still see and feel that there is a lot of support in governments, among the people and so on. But it's becoming more and more difficult because the context has been changing. And for example, we have observed now how, because of the elections in a number of countries, like internal agenda is dominating some of the discussion. And it doesn't mean that people do not want to support Ukraine or the government do not want, but there are a lot of other things that start to pile up on their files. For example, as it has been in US, when the internal discussions have made the passage of this supplemental bill very complicated. And now with the US elections, we also are not sure how situation will be after November. And so on one hand, the support is still there, but the complexity of issues, I mean, it has been 2.5 years of this full-scale invasion, and some countries have been working very hard to support us, but it's becoming more complicated to balance all these different priorities and things that are there. And of course, we are also talking about quite sensitive issues, for example, about strikes from Ukraine into the Russian territories or the possibility to shut down the missiles. And these are sensitive discussions, and they are not always very comfortable to our partners, of course.
It's a position I know we're not at yet, unfortunately, the idea of a post-war scenario. But I did want to ask you about it, because I know you've written about this and talked about this, the idea of what a post-war relationship between Ukraine and Russia might look like, because there will have to be a post-war relationship. You are sort of condemned to live next door to each other. But you've written about or talked about this idea of a process of, I think, de-Russiization, as you put it, this idea that Russia might have to rethink how it sees the world, and I guess undergo a similar kind of period of reckoning to maybe that which Germany did after World War II. Is there anything you think anybody can do to help bring that thought process about in Russia, or does Russia just have to lose this war and then figure that out by itself?
Well, I think that the process of Russia losing this war will help Russia transition into that way. But it's also, I think the important part of it is about accountability. And here the partners have a big role to play as well, because I think that we need to see Putin and all the top, Russian leadership who has made this war into action. We need to see them in the tribunal. And this is also partially responsibility of our partners to be pushing this. Because without that, I think also this full understanding of the accountability for the crimes committed will not be there for Russians.
I mean, does that strike you as I can see how it's a desirable prospect, and I know that there is this warrant already issued for President Putin, but is this something you actually think you can see for real one day actually happening?
I hope so. And of course, I know that there is some doubts among some of the partners how much this is a feasible thing, but I think he's a war criminal and he should be there.
What I wonder about in terms of a post-war scenario, and also how this war ends, is how great a fear is it for you that there will be some kind of compromise eventually forced upon Ukraine, possibly in terms of territory? Is it part of your advocacy to stop people from drifting down those lines of thinking?
Yeah, we are concerned, of course, and these discussions have been unfolding again. I think it's naive to believe that Russia is actually willing to negotiate, because what Russia wants is to impose the way that they see the world and the way they want the outcome to be. And, this is not the negotiations. It's basically an ultimatum from Russia about how things should be. And I don't think this should be acceptable for neither Ukraine or our partners.
Iryna Krasnoshtan there in conversation with Andrew Muller. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally today, listeners will know that Monocle had a big presence in the French capital for the Olympic Games. And one of our regular voices was Monocle's own roving Olympics correspondent, Kieran Pender. And I'm delighted to say that we can now also add Paralympics to his title, and that Kieran joins me in the studio now on your way back home to New Zealand. Kieran, you must be absolutely exhausted.
It's been a time, it's been a summer, but I've had a bit of a holiday in between, and pleased to be heading home now.
Well, give us a recap of your experiences in Paris.
It was just one of the most amazing Olympics. It was my second Olympics. I covered the Tokyo Games, which with COVID was obviously quite a restrictive experience, but speaking to other more seasoned Olympic correspondents in Paris, they were really rating that as one of the best Olympics in their memory. There's some journalists who've covered Olympics going back to the 70s and the 80s, and I think it was really seen as up there. London and Sydney are two of the landmark Olympics of this millennia, and I think it was seen as up there, if not better than those. I think particularly a huge success for the French that I think a lot of other cities in the future will look to capitalise on is really bringing the Games to the city, rather than there's a sort of a history of building new white elephant stadiums on the outskirts in the hope that, and sometimes there's good reason for that, engaging new regions, building in as cities grow, but to have most of the games in the heart of Paris. For me, one of the memories that will remain with me for a long time was the beach volleyball under the Eiffel Tower in the evening. What a sight. Or the BMX and the skating in Place de la Concorde. Some of my colleagues went to the fencing in the Grand Palais. The French did a fantastic job of bringing the Olympics to Paris.
And how enthusiastic were the crowds? Because at first we were told that the French themselves had largely fled the capital, but then they seemed to come back.
They did, and I, speaking to French friends who said them and their friends had left, deliberate decision, they wanted to get out, and then as they saw the hype build over the Games, they all came back. And I think that really crystallised with the Olympic road race, the men's and women's cycling that was in the heart of Paris, and the crowds were huge. Obviously, for many of the events, tickets had already sold out. It was hard to get resale tickets. And so if you hadn't already planned ahead, it was difficult to get involved. But the thing with the cycling is you could just stand on the street and watch the world's best cyclists go past Parisian landmarks. I mean, the iconic image of the Belgian cyclist winning the men's road race and sort of standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, lifting his bike up, that was something that was seen by hundreds of thousands of Parisians, because as the event went on, they all came back. It was really interesting, as it often is. I got into Paris a week before the Games began, and it was a really eerie vibe because there was very few people around. People were on their summer holiday. Probably more of them had left than usual. And then once the Games began, the opening ceremony was a bit hit and miss with the rain and with taking it out of a stadium and putting it on the river. But then it really felt like from then on, every day the vibe got more and more. You saw hundreds of thousands of locals in. They had a park in central Paris, Champions Park, where athletes, after they'd won gold medals, a day later would go and sort of be serenaded by the crowd. And particularly 3 years on from Tokyo, where there was no one allowed in the stadium. One of my real memories of that was covering the men's 100-metre sprint at Tokyo Stadium, a stadium of 75,000 people, and you could hear a pin drop. There were probably 500 people, journalists, staff and other athletes in the stadium. And then I was fortunate to go to the Stade de France for some of the athletics and to have 75,000 screaming French people and foreigners there cheering on some incredible sport. Really reminds us why the Olympics are so addictive and why they continue to succeed despite all the doubters. So as you said, there were so many doubts. And I think one of the successes you'd say is that none of those doubts really came to fruition. Yes, there were some issues with the water quality for the triathlon in the Seine and the open water swimming. Ultimately, it went ahead. No one got too ill as far as we know. There were huge security concerns. There were one or two issues. None of that really came to fruition. So, whether that's good luck or good planning, you've really got to credit the French for what's been an amazing Olympics.
And of course, it's not over yet because the Paralympics are still on.
Exactly. And so far, the Paralympics have also been a huge success. I know that the crowds have been really strong. There was a real push to ensure that the locals embrace the Paralympics to the same extent as they have the Olympics. Ticket sales have looked really good. There's been some fantastic action. I've been following some of the Australians in action. There have been some amazing performances. That wraps up on Sunday, and then there'll be a return to reality. I saw there's been some dispute. The French mayor has suggested that they keep the Olympic rings on the Eiffel Tower. I think some relatives of the designer of the tower decided that wasn't a good idea, and so there's been some dispute. And obviously France very quickly will return to political reality. There's still some uncertainty following the snap election. But I think the fact that they're already having those fights suggests what a legacy it will leave, because they're now arguing over what that legacy looks like.
And just looking further ahead, of course, there's Los Angeles coming up and then Brisbane.
Yep. Australia will be very pleased to host the Olympics in 2032. First up, LA, and of course the Winter Olympics coming up in 2026 in Italy. those will be two blockbuster games. As you said, there's been in the last decade or two some concern about the sustainability of the Olympics. We saw, in other mega sporting events, the World Cup going to Qatar, now going to Saudi Arabia, the Men's World Cup. There's been some concern about how viable it is for cities to continue to host these huge sporting events because of the economic cost. I think we saw with Paris a real slimmed down version. There wasn't a lot of new expenditure. The expenditure that was there wasn't Olympic specific. It was infrastructure spending on the river, on the metro, for example. But I think LA and Brisbane, two sporting powerhouse nations, and they'll put on incredible shows. And I hope to be there for Monocle.
Absolutely. We hope to have you there too. Kieran Pender, thank you very much indeed. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researcher was Sana Jamani and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.